Imagine waking up one morning to a sound you have never heard before. A sound so deep and so resonant that you feel it in your chest before your ears fully register it. A low, rhythmic bellowing rolling across a landscape that looks almost like home, but is not quite right. The trees too tall, the ferns too lush, the sky the same blue but somehow heavier, more primordial, more alive. You step outside and there, moving across the floodplain below you, is something that should not exist alongside you. Not a predator you have learned to fear, not a rival tribe, something older than fear itself. Something that evolution spent over 150 million years perfecting before the world ended its reign. A sauropod, long-necked and slow as a glacier, moving through the morning mist with the unhurried certainty of an animal that has no natural enemies large enough to trouble it. That is the question I want to sit with you tonight. What if the Great Extinction never happened? What if that rock from space, that 6-mile-wide catastrophe that punched into the shallow sea of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, missed? What if the non-avian dinosaurs survived, and we evolved anyway? And somehow, across the improbable corridors of deep time, both lineages arrived at a shared present. What would that world look like? What would we look like? And how would the presence of the largest animals that ever walked the land have shaped the consciousness, the culture, the very nervous systems of the small, upright, endlessly curious creatures that became us? This is not a story about science fiction. This is a story that uses the tools of paleontology, evolutionary biology, and paleoanthropology, the serious disciplines that reconstruct vanished worlds from bone and stone and pollen grains, to ask a rigorous question. What does the fossil record actually tell us about how life responds to coexistence with giants? What do we know about how early humans and their ancestors navigated worlds full of megafauna, full of animals that dwarfed them, outweighed them, could swallow them whole? And what happens when you take that knowledge and apply it to the most extreme possible version of that challenge? A world where the most spectacular and successful land animals in Earth's history never left. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I am always curious to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights if you have not already, take a deep breath, and let the modern world fade away. Let us begin where all good questions begin at the beginning, with what we actually know before we step into what we are imagining. The non-avian dinosaurs ruled the land for roughly 165 million years. Let that number sit for a moment because it is genuinely difficult for the human mind to absorb. Modern humans, our exact species, have existed for somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years. Our genus, Homo, stretches back perhaps 3 million years. The entire primate lineage reaches back roughly 65 million years. The dinosaurs were land vertebrates for more than twice as long as any mammal lineage has existed at all. They were not a brief experiment. They were not a failed attempt that evolution eventually abandoned. They were a triumph, a dominant ecological strategy that persisted across 3 geological periods, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, through climate shifts and sea level changes, and continental drift, and volcanic events that reshaped the world repeatedly. And then, 66 million years ago, something happened that had nothing to do with their fitness or their adaptability or any failure of their biology. A rock arrived. The Chicxulub impactor, as scientists call it, struck the Earth with a force equivalent to roughly 1 billion times the energy of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The immediate blast vaporized everything within hundreds of kilometers. The ejector, the material thrown into the atmosphere by the impact, rained back down across the entire planet as superheated fragments, igniting wildfires on a global scale. The sulfur and debris thrown into the upper atmosphere blocked sunlight for months, then years. Photosynthesis collapsed. Plants died. The food chains built on plants collapsed behind them. An estimated 75 to 80% of all species on Earth went extinct in a geologically sudden interval, perhaps as little as a few tens of thousands of years, which is the blink of an eye in the timescale we're talking about tonight. The non-avian dinosaurs, every lineage except the one that gave us birds, did not survive. But here's what matters for our thought experiment tonight. They almost did. The impactor hit at a particularly bad angle and in a particularly bad location over sulfur-rich, shallow marine sediments that amplified the atmospheric effects enormously. Had it struck elsewhere, had it struck a few degrees differently, had it struck the open ocean or a different kind of geology, the death toll might have been dramatically lower. Scientists who study the Chicxulub event have estimated that perhaps the difference between the extinction that happened and a much smaller die-off was a matter of geography and chemistry, not the force of the impact alone. The dinosaurs were not doomed, they were unlucky. So let us simply remove that bad luck. Let us say the impactor hits, but differently. The immediate destruction is still catastrophic for the region of impact, but the global winter is shorter, the photosynthetic collapse less complete. The large dinosaur lineages, the ones with the greatest territorial ranges and the most varied diets, pull through in reduced numbers. The mammals, our ancestors, also survive, as they did in reality, because they were small and burrowing and capable of eating insects and seeds through the darkest years. The world that emerges from this alternate catastrophe is damaged but recovering, and it contains both lines. Now, 66 million years is a very long time. The world that emerges from this shared survival is not the world of Jurassic Park, with velociraptors and T-Rex living alongside modern humans, because modern humans would not exist for another 60-some million years. The evolutionary clock keeps ticking in both lineages. The dinosaurs that survived the impact event would have evolved enormously. Some would have gone extinct in subsequent extinction pulses. Others would have diversified into new ecological niches. The landscape of life would look different from what we know. And the mammals, freed from some of the competitive pressure but never entirely free from the shadow of giant reptiles, would also have evolved differently. Perhaps more slowly toward large body sizes. Perhaps more cautiously. Perhaps more intelligently. Because the pressure of navigating a world of apex predators is as one of the strongest drivers of cognitive complexity we know of. This is actually where the question gets genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint, because we do not have to purely speculate. We have a rich record of how early hominins, our actual ancestors, navigated worlds full of large and dangerous animals. The African savanna where our lineage evolved was not a safe place. It was filled with predators that we did not compete with, but learned to coexist alongside. Lions and leopards and hyenas and wild dogs, and the now extinct forms of these animals that were even larger and more dangerous. Saber-toothed cats, belonging to the genus Megantherion and later Homotherium, stalked the same landscapes where Australopithecus and early Homo walked upright and learned to use stone tools. The giant short-faced bear, the Duinophilis, a saber-toothed cat with a particular fondness for hominins as prey, has been found in the same fossil contexts as our early ancestors at sites in South Africa. We were prey animals for a very long time, and the marks of that experience are written into our neurology, our social structures, our anxiety responses, and the very architecture of our fear. What does a hominin brain do when it lives alongside something much larger and much more dangerous than itself? It gets better at things. It gets better at reading environmental cues, at detecting the telltale signs of a predator in the grass before the predator has moved. It gets better at cooperation, because a lone hominin is easy prey and a group of hominins with throwing weapons is a problem even for a lion. It gets better at long-range planning, caching food, knowing where water is in the dry season, understanding the movement patterns of dangerous animals across a landscape. The cognitive load of surviving in a world of large predators is one of the best evolutionary pressures for the development of the kind of general intelligence that eventually became our most defining characteristic. Now take that pressure and multiply it. Take it to the level of a world that never lost its Cretaceous-era giants. Because some of the dinosaurs that survived in our thought experiment would not be harmless plant eaters. Some of them would be predators, and they would be predators of a kind that makes a lion look manageable. Close your eyes for a moment and try to place yourself there. It is perhaps 2 million years ago, in an alternate version of the East African Rift Valley, a landscape of open grassland and scattered acacia woodland, bisected by a seasonal river whose banks are thick with palms and giant ferns. The air smells of dust and grass and something older, something reptilian and faintly sulphurous. The scent that the local hominins, creatures about the size and cognitive level of Homo habilis, have learned to read the way a sailor reads the wind. They are crouched at the edge of the woodland, a group of perhaps 12 adults and several children, watching the waterhole below. They want to drink. They need to drink. But something else is already there. At the edge of the water, its feet in the mud, stands an animal perhaps 5 meters long from snout to tail, bipedal, heavily built through the legs and hips, with forelimbs that are not small and useless like those of T-Rex, which lived and died in the Cretaceous, but moderately long and clawed, useful for grappling and gripping. This is a descendant of the abelisaurid lineage, the large theropods of the southern continents, evolved over 66 million years from the forms that survived the impact event. It does not look exactly like any dinosaur you have seen in a museum or a film, because 66 million years of evolution have reshaped it, but it is unmistakably a theropod dinosaur. The recurved teeth in its jaw, the three-toed feet leaving deep impressions in the mud, the way it holds its head low, nostrils working the air. The hominins at the edge of the woodland have a word for this animal, or rather they have a sound, a specific alarm call that carries through the group in an instant, because they have been learning to fear this kind of thing for generations, beyond counting. The oldest female in the group, perhaps 35 years old, which in this world is genuinely old, taps the shoulder of the young male beside her, and points with 2 fingers, not at the predator, but at the wind. She has noticed something he has not. The wind is blowing from the waterhole toward the woodland. The predator has not scented them yet. She begins to move, silently, leading the group along the woodland edge, making a wide arc around the waterhole, planning to approach from the downwind side, intending to wait until the predator moves on. This is not instinct. This is knowledge, accumulated and transmitted. Knowledge about wind and predator behavior and patience, and the specific habits of this kind of animal in the dry season. It is the kind of knowledge that the group's children are watching carefully and will carry forward. This is what surviving alongside large predators does to a lineage. It selects relentlessly for exactly these capacities: observation, memory, the ability to model another animal's behavior and predict its movements, the ability to transmit complex tactical knowledge without words, or with the earliest, simplest words, the ability to plan multiple steps ahead, and the ability to tolerate fear long enough to think through it rather than simply run. But theropod predators are only part of the story, because in this world, the large herbivorous dinosaurs also survived, and they present a completely different kind of challenge, one that may have been just as important for shaping hominin cognition. Imagine the same alternate East African landscape, but now in the wetter season, when the savanna grasses are waist high and the acacia trees are in leaf, and the distant mountains are shrouded in cloud. And moving through this landscape, perhaps 4 kilometers from the hominin group's current position, is a herd of ornithopod dinosaurs, Large bipedal herbivores descended from Cretaceous forms like the hadrosaurs, but evolved over tens of millions of years into something that better fits the open grasslands of an alternate Miocene. They are large animals, the adults perhaps 3 to 4 meters at the shoulder, when they occasionally drop onto all fours, which they do when feeding in dense vegetation. There are perhaps 40 of them, and where they move, the grass is flattened and the ground is churned, and the smaller animals, the mammals and the birds and the small reptiles, scatter and reset in their wake. For the hominin group, this herd is simultaneously an opportunity and a danger. The young, the injured, and the very old among these animals are potential food sources. A single adult ornithopod contains more meat than the group could consume in a week. But bringing one down requires coordination and planning and the right landscape, and getting it wrong, getting too close to the healthy adults, means being trampled or being struck by the massive tail that the animals swing defensively when threatened. The hominins have been hunting the margins of these herds for generations. The oldest members remember where the herds move in the dry season. They have mental maps of the landscape built around the movement corridors of these animals, the places where the terrain funnels the herd and slows them, the riverbanks where the old and sick tend to stray, the specific times of day when the animals are drinking and less alert to threats approaching from upwind. All of this knowledge is survival knowledge. All of it requires a brain capable of holding complex spatial information, temporal patterns, behavioral models of large non-human animals, and the social organization to share and transmit this information across generations. The cognitive demands of hunting large dinosaur prey and avoiding large dinosaur predators would have placed an evolutionary premium on exactly the kinds of cognition that eventually produced, in our actual world, language and art and symbolic thought. The alternate world we are imagining might, paradoxically, have produced hominins with faster developing social intelligence, because the selective pressures would have been more extreme. But let us think carefully about whether those hominins would have had the same trajectory as our actual ancestors. Because there is a counter-argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. In the actual history of life on Earth, the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs created a massive vacuum of ecological opportunity. The large body size niches, the roles of megaherbivore and apex predator and large cursorial predator had been occupied by dinosaurs for 165 million years. When the dinosaurs vanished, mammals rushed into those vacated niches with astonishing speed. Within 10 million years of the end Cretaceous extinction, mammals had diversified into an enormous range of body sizes and ecological roles. Giant browsing mammals appeared. Large predatory mammals appeared. The whales, descended from terrestrial mammals, began their return to the sea. The ungulates, the hoofed mammals that now dominate savanna ecosystems, diversified explosively, and the primates, freed from the constant pressure of giant predators, began experimenting with larger bodies, arboreal lifestyles, and increasingly complex social structures. In the alternate world, where the large dinosaur lineages persisted, the mammals would not have had that open field. They would have been competing with animals that had 65 million years more experience at being large and dominant. The ecological niches that our actual ancestors exploited, the open savanna niche, the large cursorial hunter niche, the cooperative pack hunter niche, might all have been filled by dinosaur lineages that had been refining those strategies since before the first primate climbed a tree. Our ancestors might have been kept small, kept arboreal, kept in the margins. The hominin lineage, if it emerged at all, might have emerged more slowly, more cautiously, with a longer evolutionary history of subordination rather than ecological dominance. And here is where the question gets genuinely complex. Because there are two plausible and very different alternate histories here, and both are scientifically defensible from what we know about evolutionary biology. In the first scenario, the presence of large predatory dinosaurs drives our ancestors toward faster cognitive evolution. Fear is a powerful engine. The groups that could think faster, plan better, communicate more effectively, and cooperate more efficiently with stone weapons against a theropod predator would have survived at higher rates. Intelligence as a survival strategy might have been selected for even more strongly than it was in our actual history. In this scenario, early hominins might have arrived at language, at complex tool use, at the first sparks of symbolic thought, somewhat earlier than they did in our world, because the stakes were higher and the losers did not reproduce. In the second scenario, the ecological pressure from large dinosaurs keeps hominins smaller, more arboreal, more socially cautious, and the particular trajectory that led in our actual world to bipedalism and the freeing of the hands for tool use is delayed or takes a different form. Perhaps hominins in this world develop a different kind of intelligence, more spatial, more focused on environmental reading, less focused on the social complexity and theory of mind that seem to have been so important in our actual evolutionary history. Perhaps the story of intelligence in this world is written not by hominins at all, but by some other lineage entirely. The honest answer is that we do not know which scenario is more plausible, and that uncertainty is itself one of the most interesting things about the question. Evolution is not a march toward a predetermined endpoint. It is a series of responses to environmental pressures, and changing the environment changes the responses. The particular kind of mind that you and I have tonight, the mind that is lying in the dark listening to this, is not the inevitable product of 4 billion years of life on Earth. It is one specific solution to one specific set of environmental challenges, and other challenges might have produced other solutions. But let us keep imagining. Let us say that the first scenario is closer to the truth, that our ancestors did emerge, did stand upright, did develop stone tools and fire and language, and eventually the full complexity of human culture, in a world where non-avian dinosaurs still walked the Earth. What would that world have looked like at the point we might call the equivalent of the late Stone Age, perhaps 50,000 years ago? What would human societies have built around the reality of coexisting with creatures of that scale? Start with the practical. Fire would have been even more central to human life in this world than it was in ours. In our actual world, fire served as protection against the large predators of the African savanna, and the evidence suggests that Homo erectus was managing fire at least by 800,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. In a world with active large theropod predators, fire would have been not just useful, but existentially critical. A fire-ringed camp, maintained through the night, would have been the difference between survival and predation for any human group, anywhere within range of a large carnivorous dinosaur. The cultural elaboration around fire, the rituals, the mythology, the social structures organized around the firekeeper's role, would have been even more developed and more central to human identity than in our actual history. The settlements humans built in this world would have reflected that reality. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans in our actual American Southwest, built high on vertical canyon walls and accessible only by precarious hand and footholds, were constructed in response to the social threats of rival human groups. In our alternate world, the same impulse toward vertical refuge would have been driven by an additional and more primal threat. Theropod predators, even the most capable, are not good at climbing vertical surfaces or navigating extremely narrow ledges. The high places, the cliff faces and the rocky outcrops, and the dense canopy of old forest where the footing is complex and the sightlines are good, would have been the premium real estate of the alternate human world. Archaeological sites in our thought experiment would cluster consistently in defensible, high elevation positions, and the stone walls that early humans built would have been less about territorial boundary marking and more about creating barriers that large bipedal predators could not easily breach. The rock art of this world would be extraordinary. In our actual world, the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira and Chauvet, dating to between 17,000 and 36,000 years ago, are dominated by the animals that mattered most to the people who made them. Horses, aurochs, bison, rhinoceros, mammoth. The animals that were hunted, feared, perhaps venerated, they are rendered with astonishing skill and an obvious intimacy born of long observation. The people who painted a horse on the wall of Chauvet knew that horse the way a lifelong naturalist knows a species. Every curve of its muscles, the particular way it holds its head when alert, the color gradient of its coat. They had been watching horses their entire lives, and their parents had been watching horses and their grandparents before them. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. In our alternate world, the animals on the cave walls would be different. You would find the herbivorous dinosaurs, the large hadrosaur descendants, and the ceratopsian-derived grazers, rendered with the same detailed intimacy, because these animals would have been the primary prey species for large-scale cooperative human hunting. You would find the theropod predators rendered with something more complex than the straightforward documentation of a prey animal, with the same kind of layered, possibly ritually charged attention that we see in our world's cave art when it depicts lions and bears. The dangerous animals that occupied a different category in the human imagination than the ones you ate for dinner. The dinosaur predators in this world's art would be depicted with the specificity of creatures that every member of the community knew and feared personally, and probably also with the particular visual formalism that tends to emerge when a culture is representing something it considers sacred or supernaturally powerful. Because here is something that the actual archaeological record consistently shows us. When human cultures encounter animals that are large enough and powerful enough to kill them, and do kill them with regularity, those animals almost always become spiritually significant. The lion in African traditional cultures, the bear in circumpolar cultures stretching from Scandinavia across Siberia to North America, the jaguar in Mesoamerican cultures, the crocodile across a wide swathe of African and South Asian religious traditions. Animals that can kill you do not stay merely practical. They become symbols, intermediaries between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. Embodiments of power and danger, and the thin line between life and death. The shaman's role in many traditional cultures is specifically about managing the spiritual power of the large predator, negotiating with it, incorporating its power into human ritual use. In our alternate world, the shamanic traditions built around the large theropod predators would have been among the most elaborate and most deeply rooted in human spiritual life. These would be ancient traditions, reaching back perhaps 1 million years or more, continuously refined and transmitted through every generation of the lineage that survived. The theropod would occupy the same spiritual role that the cave lion and the cave bear occupied in the imagination of Paleolithic Europeans, but with the weight of a much longer shared history. These traditions would not be peripheral. They would be central. They would be the spine around which human religious thought organized itself. Because the most fundamental question any culture has to answer is how to relate to the forces that can end you. And in this world, those forces would be very large and very ancient and very real. Let us imagine for a moment the ritual life of a human community in this alternate world, living somewhere in the temperate zone of what we might recognize as Western Europe, perhaps 40,000 years ago. The community lives in the entrance to a long cave system, which they have chosen for 2 reasons. The rock above them provides shelter from the weather, and more importantly, the entrance is too narrow for any large dinosaur to enter. They have widened and smoothed a shelf of rock, about 3 meters above the cave floor where they sleep, accessed by notched log ladders that they pull up behind them each night. The fire burns at the entrance from dusk to dawn, tended in rotation by whoever is on watch. Below the sleeping shelf, carved into the cave wall with a flint burin at the level where firelight reaches, are the painted images that the community has added to over many generations. Some are old, the red ochre faded to a rust brown, depicting the large hadrosaur descendants in profile, beautifully observed. the arch of the neck, the crest, the characteristic way the foot lands when the animal is moving at speed. Some are newer, black outlines made with manganese pigment, depicting the theropod predator that the community knows and fears. The particular one that has been hunting the valley for at least 3 winters, recognized by the unusual coloring on its snout that the oldest members of the community remember from their own childhoods. That image of the predator is not just documentation, it is something more. The community's elder, a woman who is also the keeper of what they know about the behavior and movement of large dinosaurs in the valley, comes to this image on specific nights. The nights when the community needs to make a decision about moving camp, or when a young person is about to go through the ceremony that will mark them as a full adult hunter. She traces the outline of the image with her fingers and speaks to it, not because she believes the painting is the animal, but because the painting is a way of addressing what the animal represents. The dangerous power of the world beyond the firelight. The thing that you must know and must respect and must sometimes negotiate with if you are going to survive. The young people watch her do this and will do it themselves one day. The knowledge encoded in this ritual is not primarily supernatural, it is practical. The elder's speech at the image is a recitation of what the community knows about theropod behavior, their hunting patterns, their seasonal movements, the signs that warn of their proximity, the techniques that have worked to drive them away from a campsite or a kill. The ritual form is the preservation technology. In a world without writing, the things that are repeated in formal, ritual contexts are the things that survive. The painting is a mnemonic. The ceremony is a curriculum. The spirit of the predator that the elder addresses is also, in the same gesture, the accumulated wisdom of every human who has survived an encounter with something of that size. Now, let us think about the ecological and evolutionary trajectory of the dinosaurs themselves in this alternate timeline, because they would not have stood still for 66 million years. The dinosaurs that survived the impact event would have experienced a prolonged period of stress and reduced population. Those that emerged from the aftermath would have been, on average, smaller-bodied and more ecological generalists than their Cretaceous predecessors, because the generalists are always better at surviving catastrophes. The Cretaceous giants, the titanosaur sauropods that reached lengths of 30 meters or more, the truly enormous theropods, might not have made it through even a reduced impact winter. What survived would have been smaller, more adaptable, more Catholic in their diets. Over the following 66 million years, those survivors would have diversified again, filling niches as the world recovered. Some lineages would have gone extinct in subsequent environmental changes. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, roughly 56 million years ago, brought a rapid warming event that stressed ecosystems globally. The gradual cooling trend of the Oligocene and Miocene would have pressed other lineages. Ice ages would have been particularly challenging for ectothermic or partially ectothermic animals, creatures whose body temperature depends partly on the ambient environment. This is a critical point because the question of dinosaur physiology is one of the most interesting and most contested areas of modern paleontology. For most of the 20th century, paleontologists assumed that dinosaurs were ectotherms, like modern reptiles, relying on external heat sources to regulate their body temperature. This assumption was used to explain their eventual inability to survive the post-impact winter, among other things. But the evidence that has accumulated over the past 4 decades has dramatically complicated this picture. Bone histology, the microscopic study of bone growth patterns, has revealed that many dinosaurs grew at rates that are consistent with warm-blooded or partially warm-blooded animals. The discovery of insulating proto-feathers on a wide range of theropod dinosaurs, not just the small ones, has added another layer. The metabolic modeling of large sauropods has suggested that their enormous size might have generated enough internal heat through sheer bulk that they were functionally warm, regardless of their metabolic strategy. The emerging consensus is that dinosaurs occupied a range of metabolic strategies, some more ectothermic, some approaching endothermy, full warm-bloodedness, and many somewhere in between. If that is accurate, then in our alternate timeline, the dinosaurs that survived into the Paleogene and beyond would have been subject to the same cold weather pressures that other reptiles faced, but not as uniformly vulnerable as the old cold-blooded model would suggest. Lineages with higher metabolic rates would have been better positioned to survive cold intervals. Ice Age climates would have selectively pressured the dinosaur lineages toward either endothermy or toward geographic refugia in lower latitudes, the same tropical and subtropical zones where reptiles today reach their greatest diversity. This means that in our alternate world, the distribution of large dinosaurs would likely have been sharply skewed toward the tropics and subtropics, with decreasing diversity and abundance as you move toward higher latitudes. The temperate zones would have been dominated by the more cold-tolerant lineages, perhaps smaller-bodied and more fully endothermic descendants of the Cretaceous forms. The far north and south would have been largely free of the large dinosaur lineages. The Ice Age refugia of Europe and Asia and North America, the places where our actual ancestors survived the last glacial maximum, would have been environments where the dinosaur fauna was sparse, limited to the most cold-adapted descendants. Human populations in high-latitude glacial environments might have had less to fear from large dinosaur predators, simply because those environments would have been inhospitable to the largest and most dangerous forms. This geographic dynamic would have had profound effects on human culture and migration. In our actual world, human groups expanded into Europe and Asia from African origins, spreading into environments that were challenging but not dominated by the kinds of apex predators that large theropods represent. In the alternate world, movement out of the tropics into the temperate zone might have been experienced as entering a less dangerous world, a place where the largest predators were smaller and less specialized. This would have had implications for population density and cultural exchange. Higher latitude human populations, less constrained by the cognitive overhead of navigating a world of giant predators, might have had more energy to invest in cultural elaboration, in art and ritual and the development of trade networks, simply because their everyday survival was somewhat less precarious. Meanwhile, the tropical and subtropical zones would have remained contested terrain, rich in resources, but also richly dangerous. The human groups that stayed, or that moved into those environments despite the risks, would have developed the most elaborate and the most deeply specialized knowledge systems, the richest ritual traditions around the predators that defined their world. The diversity of human cultures in our alternate world might have tracked the diversity of the dinosaur fauna very closely, with the most complex spiritual traditions concentrated exactly where the large dinosaurs were most numerous and most dangerous. There is something else worth thinking about, something that the actual archaeological record of human evolution raises in a new light when you imagine it in the context of our alternate world. The question of why humans developed projectile weapons. The atlatl, the spear thrower, is a remarkable technology. It is a short stick with a hook at the end that extends the effective length of the arm, dramatically increasing the velocity and range of a thrown spear. There is evidence for atlatl use in our actual world going back perhaps 25,000 years, though the spears being thrown may be older. The bow and arrow follows, with the earliest convincing evidence in Africa around 65,000 years ago. Both technologies have in common that they allow a human to kill a large animal from a distance, from beyond the range where that animal can easily kill back. In our actual world, this standoff capability was developed against large mammals, against the megafauna of the Pleistocene, the mammoth and the woolly rhino and the giant bison and the cave bear. It worked because those animals, large as they were, could be brought down with enough projectile wounds, because they bled and their biology was familiar, because a mammal's vulnerability to blood loss and organ damage could be predicted from the hunter's own experience of mammalian physiology. But a large theropod dinosaur is not a mammal. Its physiology is different. The distribution of vital organs in its body is different. The thickness and arrangement of its skeletal structure is different. A projectile weapon that would eventually bring down a woolly mammoth might not be effective against an 8-meter theropod, whose vital organs are protected by ribs that are themselves as long as a human arm. The practical problem of killing a large theropod, or even of effectively deterring one, might have driven human projectile technology in different directions. Toward heavier projectiles, toward different impact geometries, toward the development of multi-part hafted weapons with broader stone points designed to maximize tissue damage on a thick-skinned target. Or perhaps more likely, toward poison. The use of plant and animal toxins on hunting weapons is ancient and widespread in our actual world, documented in the archaeological record back at least 24,000 years at Border Cave in South Africa, where a wooden applicator with residue consistent with ricin or a similar plant toxin was found. In many tropical traditional cultures, the use of poison on projectiles is the primary hunting technology for large and dangerous game because it removes the need for immediate lethality on impact. The hunter can wound the animal, retreat to safety, and wait for the toxin to do its work. Against a large theropod predator, this strategy might have been the most viable one available to Paleolithic humans. The development of a sophisticated pharmacological tradition around dinosaur hunting toxins in our alternate world is not only plausible, but seems almost inevitable given the selective pressure. Which means that the alternate world's humans would have been experts in plant toxicology on a level that our actual ancestors were not quite driven to achieve. The knowledge of which plants produce which effects on which animals, the understanding of dosage and application and timing, the ability to combine multiple toxins for synergistic effects. These are complex bodies of knowledge that require systematic observation over many generations to develop and refine. A tradition of dinosaur hunting pharmacology would have been one of the most important bodies of knowledge a human community could possess. Carefully transmitted and carefully guarded, held by specialists within the community in the same way that shamanic traditions in our actual world tend to concentrate specific technical knowledge in the hands of particular individuals. The pharmacological specialists in this world would have been among the most powerful and most respected members of their communities, not because of supernatural authority, though they would have had that too, but because of practical indispensability. You could not hunt the large prey animals or effectively deter the large predators without their knowledge. They would have been the people who traveled most widely, trading for specific plant materials that did not grow locally, building networks of exchange with other communities, carrying their expertise across geographic boundaries in ways that fostered cultural contact and knowledge exchange. In a very real sense, the dinosaur hunting pharmacologists of this alternate Stone Age world might have been the same kinds of knowledge brokers and long-distance network builders that we see in our actual archaeological record in the people who moved obsidian and ochre and marine shells across vast distances tens of thousands of years ago. Let us think now about the large herbivorous dinosaurs, because they are not just a backdrop to the predator story. They are one of the central ecological facts of the alternate world, and they would have shaped human life in ways that go beyond simple prey and predator relationships. The hadrosaur descendants, the large ornithopods of our imagined alternate world, are among the most successful herbivores in the history of life. In the Cretaceous, hadrosaurs were extraordinarily abundant, found on every continent that had land in the right latitude range, often forming the dominant large herbivore community in their ecosystems. They were gregarious, highly social animals, living in herds that could number in the hundreds, migrating across vast distances, capable of feeding on a very wide range of plant material. They were also vocal, in some cases spectacularly so. The elaborate hollow crests of some hadrosaur species have been analysed as resonating chambers, producing loud and complex calls that could carry across large distances, used for communication within the herd and for distinguishing individuals and species. The descendants of these animals evolved over 66 million more years, would have retained and elaborated on these characteristics. In our alternate world, the large herbivore herds would have moved across the landscape in patterns that human communities tracked and organized their lives around, exactly as nomadic peoples in our actual world organized their seasonal movements around the migrations of bison or reindeer or wildebeest. But the scale would have been larger, the animals more dramatic. The sound of a major herd on the move, something that could be heard from kilometers away and felt through the ground underfoot before it was seen. The human communities that followed these herds would have developed highly specialized ecological knowledge, intimate familiarity with the behavioral patterns of specific dinosaur species across the full annual cycle. They would have known the calving grounds and the winter refugia and the specific river crossings and the particular grassland corridors that the herds used year after year. This knowledge would have been among the most precious things a community possessed, because it told them where food would be available at each season, which is the foundation of all survival planning in a hunter-gatherer context. The names these communities gave to the individual animals they recognized, the terms they developed for different age classes and sex classes and behavioral states, the classification systems they built around the vast diversity of large dinosaur herbivores would have constituted an elaborate and sophisticated body of folk taxonomy, a pre-scientific biology built from generations of attentive observation. Modern ethnobiological research consistently finds that hunter-gatherer and subsistence agricultural communities develop classification systems for locally important animals and plants that are extraordinarily detailed and often correspond closely to formal biological taxonomy. The people who depend on an animal for their survival know that animal more deeply than any casual observer. In our alternate world, with animals of this scale and this complexity and this ecological centrality, the folk biology of large dinosaurs would have been one of the great intellectual achievements of the prehistoric human mind. Think about what that would mean for the development of language. One of the theoretical frameworks for language evolution in our actual world, associated with the linguist Derek Bickerton and others, proposes that a major driver of language complexity was the need to communicate about large, ecologically important animals, their presence, their behavior, their movement, the locations of resources associated with them. The vocabulary and grammatical structures needed to say the herd is moving north toward the river, crossing in the dry season. Wait 3 days before following is more complex than the vocabulary needed for most basic social communication. The need to encode and transmit complex ecological knowledge is a plausible driver of syntactic complexity, of the development of the kind of language that can describe events distant in time and space, that can carry conditional statements and temporal sequences. In our alternate world, where the ecologically important animals are larger, more diverse, and more behaviorally complex, this pressure toward linguistic elaboration would have been correspondingly stronger. The language of the alternate world's humans might have developed earlier, and with a particular richness in vocabulary around dinosaur behavior and ecology. In the same way that the languages of pastoral peoples in our actual world tend to have exceptionally rich vocabularies around the animals they herd and the landscapes those animals inhabit. There is something else, something more intimate and harder to quantify, that I want you to sit with as we move deeper into this thought experiment. The question of what it would feel like, at a level below language and culture, to live in a world where animals of that scale are a daily reality. We have lost something in our actual world that is difficult to recover even imaginatively. The Pleistocene megafauna, the mammoths and the giant ground sloths and the woolly rhinos and the cave bears and the short-faced bears and the gomphotheris and the glyptodonts and the diprotodons of Australia. All of the enormous animals that shared the world with our actual ancestors are almost entirely gone. Most of them were driven to extinction by a combination of human hunting pressure and climate change, with the exact balance of causes still debated. A few survived into the historical period and are still alive. Elephants, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, and we can read something in the encounter with these surviving giants, in the particular quality of attention that even a modern person gives to a living elephant or a healthy wild rhinoceros. A quality that is different from the attention we give to other animals, older, more rooted, more full of something that is not quite fear and not quite awe, but is something compound and primal that seems to involve both. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Our nervous systems remember large animals, not as individuals, not as cultural knowledge, but as a baseline orientation, a readiness, a particular quality of environmental alertness that is activated in the presence of something very large and very alive. Evolutionary psychologists call this megafaunal attention bias, the tendency of human perception to snap to large animals in the environment with a speed and a salience that smaller animals do not trigger in the same way. It is as though the brain has a dedicated channel for big things moving in the world, a channel that was selected for across millions of years of evolution in a world full of large animals, and that persists in us now even though most of the large animals are gone. In our alternate world, that channel would never have been underused. From birth to death, every member of every human community would have lived in constant awareness of the large dinosaurs in their environment. Not constant terror, because you cannot sustain terror indefinitely and function as a social and cognitive being. But constant calibration, a baseline of alert attention to the world beyond the camp, to the quality of the sounds, to what the smaller animals are doing, to the direction of the wind. This is actually a quality that modern researchers who have worked closely with traditional hunter-gatherer communities in environments with dangerous megafauna, such as the forested regions of Central Africa and the savannas of East Africa, consistently note in the people they work with. A quality of environmental attunement, a peripheral awareness of the living world, that most modern people living in built environments have largely lost. In our alternate world, that quality would have been universal, shared by every human community everywhere on the planet that had large dinosaurs in its vicinity. The human brain in this world would have been, in one specific sense, more engaged with its environment at every moment than ours typically is. The cognitive architecture of environmental awareness, which in our world tends to atrophy in the absence of genuine environmental complexity and threat, would have been kept continuously exercised and continuously refined. Whether this would have produced better or worse outcomes for the development of the kind of reflective, introspective, symbol-manipulating intelligence that eventually produced writing and mathematics and science is an open question. But it would have produced a different kind of mind, one that was more fully integrated into its biological environment, less able to forget that it lived in a world of other living things with their own scales and their own power. Now let us think about what the first true modern humans, the people with fully modern behavioral complexity, art and music, and narrative and long-distance trade, would have made of the world if they emerged in it alongside living non-avian dinosaurs. In our actual world, the earliest unambiguous evidence for modern human behavioral complexity, for the full suite of symbolic capacities that distinguish us from all prior hominins, appears in the African record somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. The Blombos cave site on the southern coast of South Africa, excavated with extraordinary care over 3 decades by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood and his colleagues, has yielded evidence of ochre processing, geometric engravings on ochre pieces, perforated shell beads used as ornaments, and complex composite tool technology, all dating to roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. The people at Blombos were not transitional or experimental in their symbolic capacities. They were fully modern in the relevant sense. They were making art. They were decorating their bodies. They were using language complex enough to coordinate the production of the sophisticated tools and the gathering and processing of the symbolic materials. In our alternate world, at this same chronological horizon, the world would have been geographically divided, much as I described earlier, with larger and more dangerous dinosaur fauna concentrated in tropical and subtropical zones, more limited and smaller bodied lineages at higher latitudes. The fully modern humans emerging in Africa would have been emerging in the zone of maximum dinosaur diversity, in a world where the development of symbolic culture and the navigating of a complex, dangerous biological environment were happening simultaneously. The first art of our alternate world would have been marked by this context. Not just on cave walls, but on bodies. Ochre body decoration has ancient roots in our actual world, with ochre processing sites going back at least 300,000 years. In our alternate world, the decoration of the human body would have served additionally as a technology of dinosaur management. Specific pigment patterns worn during hunting expeditions might have been developed to break up the human silhouette against background vegetation, functioning as a form of disruptive camouflage. Other patterns might have been worn as identification markings, making individual members of a hunting party instantly recognizable to each other during the confusion of a large-scale cooperative hunt. The aesthetics of body decoration in this world would have grown partly from the same practical hunting knowledge that governed everything else, with ritual significance layered on top of functional origins, in the same way that the elaborate ceremonial regalia of many actual cultures is built on top of technologies that began as practical equipment. The shell beads of Blombos, in our alternate world's equivalent, would have carried social meanings organized partly around the dinosaur-related knowledge and status systems that governed community life. The person who had survived a specific encounter with a large theropod, or who had successfully directed a major cooperative hunt, would have worn that achievement as a social signal encoded in ornamental objects. The trade networks that carried marine shells and ochre and obsidian across hundreds of kilometers in our actual prehistoric world would have carried, in this alternate world, specific materials associated with the most important ceremonial and practical technologies of dinosaur coexistence. The particular resins and plant fibers used in constructing certain kinds of traps. The specific mineral pigments used in certain ritual contexts. The distinctive stone types that could be knapped into the large, robust projectile points required for hunting large herbivorous dinosaurs. Let me take you somewhere specific. A site that, in our alternate world, might be the equivalent of Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary 12,000-year-old stone monument in southeastern Turkey that has rewritten our understanding of the relationship between monumental architecture and the development of agriculture. In our actual world, Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people without agriculture or permanent settlements, who nonetheless organized the labor necessary to quarry and erect multi-ton limestone pillars carved with extraordinarily detailed images of animals. The animals depicted at Göbekli Tepe are almost exclusively dangerous animals. Snakes, foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, spiders, the large and the venomous and the dangerous. The site seems to have been a ceremonial center where communities gathered periodically, perhaps organized around a shared religious tradition centered on the dangerous animal world and the human relationship to it. In our alternate world, the equivalent of Göbekli Tepe, built perhaps 12 to 15,000 years ago in a region where large dinosaurs were still present, though perhaps no longer as numerous as in earlier millennia, would be organized around the most powerful animals in the local world. The stone pillars would bear images of theropod predators carved with the detailed intimacy of people who had spent their lives studying these animals. The scale of the animal imagery might be larger, reflecting the scale of the animals themselves. The ritual practices performed at this site might have involved the use of the dinosaur hunting pharmacological traditions I mentioned earlier, the plant toxins, and their applications, which by this point would have accumulated thousands of years of refinement and ritual elaboration. The site would have been a place of knowledge transmission at the grandest scale, a gathering point for communities from a wide region who came together to renew the shared ceremonial and practical traditions that allowed human life to persist in a world of giants. The social function would have been similar to what archaeologists think Göbekli Tepe served in our actual world, a center that reinforced collective identity and coordinated the transmission of specialized knowledge, but with even higher stakes, because the knowledge being transmitted was genuinely life or death in a way that perhaps exceeded even the profound practical importance of the knowledge systems represented at the actual Göbekli Tepe. And now I want you to think about what would have happened. In this alternate world, as human population grew and technology advanced, in the period that in our actual world corresponds to the Neolithic, the development of agriculture and settled villages, and the beginning of the long path towards civilization. Because the relationship between humans and large animals changes dramatically when humans stop being pure foragers and begin to manage the landscape for food production. In our actual world, the transition to agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, happened in a world from which most of the Pleistocene megafauna had already been removed, largely by the hunting pressure of the very modern humans who were now turning to farming. The large animals that early agricultural communities had to deal with were mostly smaller, more manageable ones. The wild boar, the aurochs, the wild horse, the wild sheep, and goat. These are animals that were domesticated, brought under human management because their social structure and their behavioral flexibility made domestication possible. What happens to this trajectory in a world where the large dinosaur fauna is still present? Domestication, in our actual world, required specific conditions. The animal had to have a social hierarchy that humans could slot into. It had to be capable of breeding in captivity. It had to have a diet that humans could manage. It had to not panic in enclosed spaces in ways that made it unmanageable. Most large dinosaur herbivores, based on what we understand of their actual Cretaceous biology, would have failed several of these criteria. They were not mammalian in their social organization. They did not have the same kind of hierarchical structure that allowed horses and cattle and dogs to accept human authority as a form of social integration. Their reproductive biology, with eggs and nest-guarding behaviors derived from their archosaur heritage, would have made captive breeding more complex. They would have been very large, requiring enormous amounts of food, and their responses to confinement would likely have been unpredictable. But the human relationship with large animals in our actual world has not been solely about domestication. It has also been about management, about partial control of wild populations for human benefit. The management of reindeer populations by Arctic peoples is a form of this. Not full domestication, but active intervention in the movements and reproduction of a wild herd for human advantage. The firestick farming of Aboriginal Australians, the deliberate burning of vegetation to manage the movements of kangaroo populations and the growth of food plants, is another form. In our alternate world, the equivalent management traditions would have been developed around the large herbivorous dinosaur herds, and they would have been both more elaborate and of longer standing than any equivalent practice in our actual world, because the need to manage the relationship with these animals would have been present for a far longer period of deep human time. The equivalent of the Neolithic in our alternate world might never have involved the full shift to sedentary agriculture that happened in our actual world. The management of large dinosaur herds might have provided a sustainable middle path, a mobile or semi-mobile lifeway organized around the known movement corridors of managed wild herds, supplemented by plant gathering and small-scale horticulture in the rich floodplain environments that large herbivores were drawn to. This is actually a highly successful subsistence strategy, one that in our actual world supported some of the most complex pre-agricultural societies known to archaeology, Among them, the societies of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, which built elaborate ceremonial traditions and hereditary social hierarchies without ever adopting grain agriculture. In our alternate world, the equivalent tradition would have been built not around salmon runs, but around dinosaur herd migrations, not around cedar planks, but around the bones and hides of the largest animals in the living world. The knowledge systems supporting this way of life would have been extraordinary in their complexity, in their integration of ecological observation, behavioral prediction, pharmacological skill, and long-range geographic knowledge. They would have been the work of every mind in every generation for hundreds of thousands of years, slowly refined, slowly deepened, slowly elaborated into the richest body of practical knowledge that any human culture had ever developed. And they would have been held not in books or in tablets or in any external storage medium, but in the memories and the ceremonies and the oral traditions and the living practice of the communities themselves. There is something I want to say here about the relationship between this knowledge and what we might call science. One of the great ongoing discussions in the history and philosophy of science is about the relationship between traditional ecological knowledge, the vast bodies of careful, systematic, empirically derived understanding that pre-scientific cultures accumulate about their local natural world, and the kind of formal, institutionalized science that emerged in Europe in the 17th century and has since spread globally. Traditional ecological knowledge in our actual world is often dismissed as merely practical, as anecdotal, as lacking the systematic rigor of formal scientific investigation. But the people who study it carefully consistently find it to be something far more sophisticated than that description implies. It is empirical. It is based on observation across very long time frames. It is tested against reality repeatedly in conditions where failure has serious consequences. It is transmitted through systems that include mechanisms for error correction. The dinosaur ecology knowledge of our alternate world would have been this, but amplified. It would have been the product of millions of person-years of observation, in conditions where getting things wrong had immediate lethal consequences, organized through transmission systems that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. It would have been the deepest and most sophisticated body of natural knowledge that any human culture ever developed, because the animals it was about were the most important, the most dangerous, and the most complex that any human community had ever had to understand. And it would have been lost, in the end, in the same way that most traditional ecological knowledge in our actual world is being lost, through the disruption of the social structures and the ceremonial contexts and the living practices that carry it. In our alternate world, as in ours, the pressures of changing climate and changing social organization and the seductive alternatives offered by new technologies would have eroded the old knowledge systems, and with them, much of the most profound understanding that the alternate human mind had achieved. But not all of it. Some of it would have persisted, as traditional ecological knowledge persists in our world, in fragments and remnants, in the folk traditions and the place names and the ritual practices of communities that still maintained a living relationship with the animals their ancestors had understood so deeply. And some of it would have been written down when writing was invented, in whatever form writing took in a culture organized around a different set of primary problems. The dinosaur herding manuals and the theropod behavior guides, and the pharmacological treatises and the seasonal migration calendars of this alternate world would have been among the most important documents that early literate culture produced, because they codified knowledge that was the foundation of everything else. But before we explore what human life in that world would have looked like in its full complexity, we need to spend real time with the animals themselves. Because the dinosaurs of popular imagination, the creatures of film posters and toy shelves, and the breathless narration of natural history television are not quite the animals that the fossil record actually describes. And the difference matters enormously for our thought experiment, because the real animals are stranger and more interesting and more challenging to human coexistence than the simplified versions most people carry in their heads. Let us start with the body of evidence, with what the rocks actually tell us. the fossil record of the non-avian dinosaurs is, in one sense, extraordinarily rich. There are thousands of named species, specimens on every continent, eggs and footprints and skin impressions and feather imprints, and, in exceptional cases, soft tissue remnants that have given paleontologists a window into the internal biology of animals that died tens or hundreds of millions of years ago. And yet, in another sense, the record is maddeningly incomplete, because fossilization is a rare and contingent process, requiring exactly the right conditions of burial and chemistry and geological stability, and the vast majority of individual animals that ever lived left no trace at all. What we have is a sample, and every sample has biases, and understanding those biases is one of the central intellectual challenges of the discipline. What the record tells us clearly is that dinosaurs were not a single thing. They were a lineage of extraordinary diversity, spanning a range of body sizes from animals smaller than a chicken to animals larger than any land creature before or since, occupying every terrestrial ecological niche from coastal wetlands to arid uplands to dense forest interiors, and displaying a range of social behaviors that the old image of the solitary, dim-witted reptile entirely fails to capture. The sauropods, the long-necked plant-eaters that include the largest land animals in Earth's history, are perhaps the most immediately iconic. Patagotitan maiorum, described from specimens found in Argentina and published in 2017, was estimated at roughly 37 to 40 meters long and perhaps 69,000 kilograms in weight. That is not a misprint. Nearly 70 metric tons. The femur, the thigh bone of this animal, is 2.4 meters long, taller than most adult humans. A single footprint left by a large sauropod in soft mud could be a meter across. When a herd of these animals moved through a landscape, they reshaped it in ways that persisted for years, creating clearings and trampling paths and altering the drainage of the ground. Their dung, deposited in enormous quantities, was a significant source of nutrients for smaller organisms. Their feeding, stripping entire trees of foliage at heights of 10 meters or more, created a kind of ecological engineering that few other animals could match. They were not just animals living in an ecosystem. They were forces that defined the ecosystem they moved through. In our alternate world, the titanosaur lineage, if it survived, would have evolved significantly over 66 million years. The very largest forms, requiring enormous food intake and highly specific vegetation types, might not have made it through the leaner years following the impact event. But the lineage as a whole, represented by smaller and more ecologically flexible members, would have had the potential to recover and diversify across the recovering Paleogene world. What the descendants would have looked like after millions of years of subsequent evolution is genuinely open. The bone structure and metabolic requirements might have shifted. The neck proportions might have changed in response to new vegetation types. But something recognizably descended from the sauropod lineage, still very large, still long-necked, still a browser of the high canopy, is entirely plausible as a persistent presence in our alternate world's large herbivore guild. The encounter between early hominins and an animal of sauropod scale would have been fundamentally different from any predator-prey encounter, or even from the encounters with the largest Pleistocene megafauna that our actual ancestors experienced. A mammoth at 4 or 5 metric tons is large. A sauropod descendant at 20 or 30 metric tons is simply in a different category of existence. It is not just bigger, it is different in kind. Its feet alone, each one a platform of bone and cartilage covering more area than a human body, represent a lethal hazard for any small creature in its path that it would never notice stepping on. Its tail, swinging in a slow arc as it walked, would carry enough force to crush a human being without any intentional violence. Simply being in the presence of an animal this large, moving at its normal pace through its normal day, would have been one of the most physically overwhelming experiences a human body could have. And yet our actual ancestors learned to coexist with the large megafauna of their time, and those animals were formidable enough. The relationship between early hominins and the large herbivores of the African savanna was not purely one of simple avoidance. Butchery marks on the bones of hippopotamus and elephant and rhinoceros at sites going back more than 1 million years tell us that early Homo was occasionally exploiting the carcasses of these very large animals. Whether through scavenging or through active hunting, we cannot always be certain. But the evidence for persistence hunting, for cooperative driving, for the use of landscape features to trap and exhaust large animals, all extends back surprisingly far into the deep prehistory of our lineage. Against a sauropod descendant, the mechanics would have been different. The animal's skin and muscle depth would have made projectile hunting extremely difficult with stone-tipped weapons. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The vital organs would have been buried under layers of tissue that no handheld weapon could easily reach. The most plausible hunting strategy would have involved the young, the sick, and the newly hatched, exploiting the vulnerability of small individuals before they grew to adult size, rather than attacking healthy adults. This kind of age-specific hunting is actually the most common large mammal hunting strategy in our actual world among traditional human hunters, and it would have been the primary strategy against sauropod lineage animals as well. But here is the other side of this equation. A large sauropod descendant would not have been a significant threat to a human being in the way that a large theropod would have been. It had no predatory intent. Its defensive behaviors would have been oriented around driving away the large theropod predators that evolved alongside it, not around the small, upright, tool-wielding creatures that hominins represented. Humans near a large herbivore herd would have had to be careful about being accidentally trampled or struck, but they would not have been targets. The greatest danger would have been the disruption to the landscape, the flattening of vegetation, and the churning of ground that a moving herd of large animals created, which could destroy temporary shelters and drive away the smaller game that human hunters also depended on. The sauropod lineage animals in our alternate world would also have been major architects of the landscape in another sense. Their feeding habits would have maintained open areas in otherwise forested zones, creating the kind of edge habitat, the transition between forest and open ground, that is consistently favored by hominin ancestors throughout the actual fossil record. Australopithecus, the earliest hominin genus, is consistently found in mosaic environments, places where woodland and open savanna and riverine forest interdigitate, and the edge zones between these habitats concentrate both food resources and the sightlines necessary for safety. Large herbivores create and maintain exactly this kind of mosaic by their grazing and browsing pressure. In our alternate world, the maintenance of the mosaic habitat that hominins needed might have depended in part on the feeding activity of very large herbivore lineages, creating a surprising and indirect form of ecological codependence. Now let us think more carefully about the theropod predators, because they are the animals that would have shaped hominin evolution most directly, most personally, and most profoundly. And here again, the actual fossil record has a great deal to say that popular representations tend to miss. The theropods of the late Cretaceous were not all T-Rex. They were a diverse group spanning an enormous range of body sizes and ecological strategies. At the large end, the tyrannosaurids, the abelisaurids of the southern continents, the carcharodontosaurids, some of which rivaled or exceeded T-Rex in size. At the intermediate range, a wide variety of medium-sized predators with different hunting styles and different prey preferences. And at the small end, a rich and diverse fauna of small to medium coelurosaurs, feathered theropods with a range of diets including insects, small vertebrates, eggs, and opportunistic scavenging. The biomechanics of the large theropods have been studied intensively over the past 3 decades, using methods that were unavailable to earlier generations of paleontologists. Computer modeling of locomotion, analysis of muscle attachment scars on bones, comparison with modern analogues in living crocodilians and large birds, measurements of bone density and stress tolerance. The emerging picture is nuanced. T. rex and its relatives were probably not the pure pursuit predators that early reconstructions imagined, charging at full speed across open ground in the manner of a lion. Their skeletons suggest they were better adapted for ambush and for the explosive burst of speed over a short distance than for sustained pursuit. They probably also engaged in scavenging when the opportunity arose, as most large carnivores do. Their huge heads and enormous bite force, the strongest of any terrestrial predator ever measured, were adapted for crushing bone as well as for subduing struggling prey, which is consistent with an opportunistic rather than a purely pursuit-based strategy. The abelisaurids, found primarily in the southern continents during the Cretaceous, were built somewhat differently. Stockier through the torso, with relatively shorter arms than the tyrannosaurs, with skulls that in some species bore elaborate ornamentation of crests and horns, whose function is debated but may have involved display or species recognition. These are the lineage that, in some scenarios for our alternate world, would have been among the most likely survivors of a reduced impact event, because they occupied a broader geographic range across the southern land masses of Gondwana, which were somewhat more distant from the primary impact site. The descendants of these animals, evolved across 66 million years in our alternate timeline, would have been substantially different from their Cretaceous ancestors. 66 million years is actually roughly the same amount of time that separates us from the Cretaceous in our own world. Think about how different the mammals of 66 million years ago were from the mammals of today. The tiny, generalized, shrew-like creatures of the early Paleocene have given rise to elephants and whales and bats and horses and primates and every other mammal alive today. The same degree of transformation applied to theropod dinosaurs given the same span of time would produce something substantially different from the Cretaceous forms we know. What directions might that evolution have taken? Several lines of ecological pressure can be identified that would have shaped theropod evolution in a world that still contained large herbivore prey. The escalating arms race between large herbivores and large predators would have continued, driving both sides toward more specialized anatomy. If the large herbivore lineages developed better defensive behaviors, herding more tightly, developing more effective anti-predator anatomy, then the predatory lineages would have been pressed toward either greater size, better cooperative hunting, or more specialized tactics. If cooperative hunting emerged as a major strategy in some theropod lineages, it would have been accompanied by the same selective pressures that drove cooperative hunting in our actual wolf and wild dog lineages, toward better communication, better behavioral coordination, perhaps even toward the rudiments of something approaching social intelligence. Some paleontologists have speculated, in the context of the real Cretaceous fauna, about whether the more cognitively complex theropods, the small feathered coelurosaurs, might have been on a trajectory toward greater intelligence had the extinction not intervened. The troodontids, a family of small, lightly built theropods with relatively large brains for their body size and forward-facing eyes, suggesting good binocular vision, have been the subject of particular speculation in this regard. Dale Russell, a Canadian paleontologist, famously proposed in the 1980s that a troodontid lineage, given another 20 to 30 million years of evolution, might have produced a bipedal, large-brained animal roughly humanoid in its body plan, which he called the Dinosauroid. This specific proposal has been criticized on various grounds, but the underlying question, whether theropod intelligence might have increased substantially given more evolutionary time, is genuinely interesting. In our alternate world, where large theropod predators are still present 66 million years after the Cretaceous, we might expect the intelligence of theropod lineages to have increased. Because intelligence is adaptive in complex social and ecological environments, and the selective pressures in a world containing both large prey and large-brained competitors like evolving hominins would have been considerable. We are not talking about theropods inventing language or building cities. We are talking about predators developing better behavioral flexibility, better problem solving around specific hunting challenges, better ability to learn from experience and modify their behavior. A level of theropod intelligence roughly comparable to the modern large corvids or the more cognitively advanced raptors, combined with the physical capabilities of a large theropod body, would have represented a genuinely formidable predatory challenge for early human communities. A predator that can learn from experience, that can modify its approach when one tactic fails, that can remember the locations of human campsites and the times when human groups are most vulnerable, is a qualitatively different challenge from a predator that operates purely on instinct and fixed behavioral patterns. The psychological weight of coexisting with a large, intelligent predator that is specifically focused on human beings as prey, as leopards were in our actual world, is one of the most profound environmental pressures a human community can face. It penetrates every aspect of life. It shapes when you move and where you sleep, and how you organize your watch rotations, and what noises you attend to in the night. In our alternate world, this pressure, scaled up to the size and capability of a large theropod with increasing behavioral flexibility, would have been the defining fact of existence for any human community in any landscape where these animals were present. The oral traditions that developed around these animals would have been among the oldest continuous cultural traditions in the world, older than agriculture, older than settled villages, older than any other institution we know of. The knowledge of theropod behavior encoded in those traditions would have been the most hard-won and most carefully preserved knowledge that human culture possessed. And the emotional register of those traditions, the quality of dread and respect and fascination, and the complex mixture of fear and something approaching reverence that attaches itself to the things that can end you, would have been one of the deepest and most consistent threads running through the entire tapestry of alternate human spiritual and cultural life. The actual archaeology of our world gives us some sense of how this works in practice. The relationship between human populations and large predators, even in the modern period, consistently produces cultural elaboration around those predators. In the tiger-inhabited forests of the Sundarbans, in the delta of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, the local Bengali communities maintain an elaborate religious tradition centered on Dakshin Rai, a forest deity manifested as the tiger, whose propitiation is a regular part of daily religious life. In the bear-inhabited regions of Siberia and northern North America, the bear is consistently found as the central figure of shamanic traditions, the intermediary between the human world and the spirit world, simultaneously feared and respected and revered. In the lion-inhabited grasslands of East Africa, the Maasai tradition of lion hunting as a rite of manhood, and the complex of beliefs and practices surrounding the lion, represents a centuries-old cultural negotiation with a species that still kills Maasai cattle and occasionally Maasai people. All of these traditions share a common structure. The dangerous predator occupies a special category in the local cosmology. It is not simply an animal. It is a principle, a force, an embodiment of something about the nature of the world that must be acknowledged and engaged with and related to through specific ritual means. The relationship is never purely practical. It always carries spiritual weight, because the question of what to do about something that can kill you is not merely a tactical question, it is also a metaphysical one. It touches on the most fundamental questions any conscious being can ask about its place in the world and the terms on which it is allowed to exist. In our alternate world, these traditions would have had a depth of time behind them that no actual human tradition can match. A ceremonial practice that has been continuously maintained and transmitted for 100,000 years accumulates a kind of authority and complexity that a newer tradition simply cannot have. The theropod-related ceremonial traditions of our alternate world's humans would have been, by the time we reach the equivalent of the late Stone Age, the most ancient and the most elaborately developed religious traditions in the history of the human species. They would have been the bedrock on which everything else was built. Let us also spend some time thinking about something that rarely comes up in discussions of this kind, which is the auditory dimension of life in a world of large dinosaurs. Because the soundscape of the alternate world would have been fundamentally different from anything we know, and the acoustic environment shapes cognitive and cultural life in ways that are subtle but pervasive. The vocalizations of large dinosaurs are a subject of genuine scientific investigation. The soft tissue of the vocal apparatus almost never fossilizes, so direct evidence is limited. But some important clues exist. The hadrosaur skull crests, as I mentioned earlier, were resonating chambers capable of producing low-frequency calls. The geometry of these crests has been analyzed using computer modeling, and the results suggest that they produced calls in the range of roughly 100 to 300 Hz, well within the range of human hearing, and at the lower end of the register where sound travels farthest through wooded and open environments. Crocodilians, the living archosaurs most closely related to dinosaurs, produce low-frequency bellows and infrasound, vibrations below the threshold of human hearing that travel enormous distances through water and ground, and can be felt as much as heard. It is reasonable to think that large dinosaurs, especially the larger sauropods, produce similar infrasonic and very low-frequency calls for communication over long distances. The constant presence of these low-frequency sounds in the alternate world's auditory environment would have been a significant ecological signal for hominin communities. A distant herd of large herbivores on the move produces infrasonic disturbance that can be felt through the ground before it can be heard. A large theropod calling in the distance is audible information about its location and, possibly, its behavioral state. Learning to read the soundscape of the dinosaur world would have been an essential survival skill, part of the same system of environmental attunement that I described earlier. The low-frequency registers of human hearing, the part of our auditory system that responds most strongly to the deep bass sounds associated with large objects moving and vocalizing, would have been continuously and meaningfully engaged by the acoustic environment of the alternate world. There is also the matter of footfall. A large sauropod walking produces seismic vibrations that travel through the ground at speeds and intensities that can be felt by a person lying on the earth at distances of several hundred meters. The ability to read ground vibration as a warning system would have been cultivated to a high degree in any human community that lived in proximity to large dinosaur fauna. Lying with an ear or a palm pressed to the ground would have been a standard nighttime scouting technique, used by the watch to detect the approach of large animals before they came into visual or auditory range in the ordinary sense. The cultural significance of ground contact, of the Earth itself as a medium of communication carrying information about the living world, would have been embedded in the cosmological and ritual traditions of alternate world humans, in ways that we can glimpse only faintly in our actual cultural record. I want to take you now to a moment that the actual fossil record does not contain, but that our thought experiment allows us to construct. A moment that I think captures something essential about what the alternate world would have been like at the level of individual human experience. It is perhaps 80,000 years ago. A woman, let us call her by the nearest approximation we can manage to a name in a language we cannot reconstruct, is sitting at the edge of a cliff above a valley in what we would recognize as the Ethiopian highlands, watching the valley below in the last hour of afternoon light. She is perhaps 25 years old. She has survived to this age in this world, which means she is already among the more fortunate members of her community, which numbers perhaps 30 people. She is the person who is best at knowing where the large animals are, which is partly a talent and partly a lifetime of concentrated observation, and partly the accumulated knowledge of her mother and her mother's mother, transmitted in the long hours of fireside conversation and the specific ceremonies that mark the transitions of the season. Below her in the valley, a pair of large theropod descendants is moving along the riverbank. They are a mated pair, she thinks, based on the way they move in parallel and the specific calls they exchange. Calls that she has heard in this valley every year for as long as she can remember. calls that she has learned to distinguish from the calls of the solitary male who works the eastern ridgeline and the smaller, younger animal that appeared 2 seasons ago. She knows these specific animals, not as an abstraction, not as a category, but as individuals with known histories, known behavioral patterns, known seasonal territories. She knows that the pair on the riverbank is less aggressive in this season than in the breeding season, which comes 3 months from now. She knows that they have a kill site near the northern bend of the river, where they tend to return for several days after a successful hunt, and that this makes the northern bend dangerous for her community's fishing expeditions until they have been seen moving away from it. She is doing, sitting on that cliff, something that we would recognize immediately as scientific observation. She is gathering data, cross-referencing it against a mental model that contains years of prior observations, and drawing conclusions that will inform decisions with immediate survival implications. She does not have words in any language we know for what she's doing, but the cognitive process is one that we would recognize. The world she's observing is vaster and more dangerous than any modern field biologist's study area, and her data collection methods are entirely embedded in her body and her memory and the oral traditions of her community rather than in notebooks or databases. But the fundamental act, the careful watching of the natural world in order to understand it and to survive within it, is the same. She turns from the valley and begins the climb back to the camp. She will tell the others what she has seen. The community will adjust its plans for the next several days accordingly. The knowledge will be absorbed into the ongoing collective understanding that keeps them alive. And the 2 animals on the riverbank, utterly unaware of having been observed and understood, will continue their evening routine, moving through a world that they dominate in scale and power, but that they share, uneasily and unknowingly, with creatures who are beginning to understand them in a way that nothing in the history of life has ever understood an animal before. That act of understanding, that specific cognitive achievement of the watching and the modeling and the transmitting, is the seed of everything that the human mind eventually became. It is the same basic cognitive process that eventually produced ecology and zoology and evolutionary biology. And it was born, in our alternate world, in the pressure of coexisting with animals that could kill you if you did not understand them. There is a deep irony in this, one that I find genuinely moving. The things that most threaten us are often the things that most develop us. The predators that kept our actual ancestors in a state of constant vigilance and constant cognitive effort were the pressure that sharpened the tool of the human mind. Remove the predators, and you remove some of that pressure. In our actual world, the gradual reduction in megafaunal diversity over the past 50,000 years, as human hunting technology improved and the Pleistocene megafauna declined, removed progressively more of that sharpening pressure. The human mind in the Holocene, the current geological epoch, is operating in an environment substantially less cognitively demanding in the relevant biological sense than the environment that produced it. We have filled that cognitive space with other challenges, with agriculture and trade and cities and writing and mathematics and science, but the original pressure, the pressure of the natural world and its dangers, has been steadily diminishing. In our alternate world, that pressure never diminished. The large theropod predators, evolved and adapted over 66 million years, would have remained a cognitive and survival challenge of the highest order for as long as human communities existed in their range. The human mind in this world would never have had the luxury of forgetting that it lived in a biologically complex and dangerous world. It would have been kept by the simple fact of the animals outside the firelight, in a state of continuous ecological engagement that our minds, in our actual world, only rarely and briefly achieve. And I think, though this is speculation, that this sustained ecological engagement would have produced a different relationship between human culture and the natural world than the one we actually developed. In our world, the trajectory of human civilization has been, in substantial part, a trajectory of separation from the natural world, of building walls between human communities and the unpredictable biological world beyond them, of replacing ecological complexity with managed simplicity, of substituting domesticated landscapes for wild ones. This is not a moral failing. It is a rational response to the real pressures of survival and the real opportunities that technology creates. But it has costs, and we are beginning to understand those costs in the context of the ecological crises that our separation from the natural world has produced. In the alternate world, the walls between human communities and the natural world could never have been built so high or so thick, because the animals that moved through that world were too large and too capable to be excluded by the barriers that human technology, at any stage before truly advanced industrialization, could have erected. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The alternate world's human cultures would have maintained a relationship with the biological world around them that was more intimate, more continuous, more embedded in daily life and daily consciousness than anything most modern humans experience. Whether this would have produced better or worse outcomes by other measures, whether it would have accelerated or delayed the development of the particular kind of abstract reasoning that produces science and technology, is an open question. But it would have produced cultures with a quality of ecological knowledge and ecological embeddedness that our actual world has largely lost. I find myself thinking, in this context, about the question of what we have forgotten. Not in the simple romantic sense that the old ways were better, because they were not better by most measurable standards of health and longevity and reduction of suffering, but in the specific sense that there are kinds of knowledge and kinds of attention and kinds of relationship with the living world that human beings are capable of developing, knowledge and attention and relationship that were once central to human life and are now largely absent from it. The alternate world is a thought experiment, but it is also a mirror, showing us what a different set of evolutionary and cultural pressures might have preserved in us that our actual history has allowed to atrophy. The last great wildlife encounters that most people in the modern world have, the ones that carry something of the quality I have been describing, the ones that produce that particular compound of fear and awe and the sense of suddenly being very small in a very large world, tend to happen at the edges, at the margins, where the managed human landscape still touches the unmanaged biological world. The moment when you round a bend in a trail and find yourself face to face with a large bear, and time stops, and everything becomes very clear and very immediate, and you are suddenly, completely, without any possibility of distraction, entirely present in the world. The moment when you are snorkeling in open water and a large shark moves below you, and something ancient in your nervous system activates that no amount of rational knowledge about shark behavior can entirely suppress. Those moments are rare now. They were not rare for most of human history. They were the texture of ordinary daily life, the background against which all other experience was set. And in our alternate world, they would have been not just more frequent, but more extreme, because the animals that produced them were larger, older, stranger, and in some ways more formidable than anything our actual ancestors faced. The encounter with a living non-avian dinosaur, an animal that belongs to a lineage entirely different from our own, at a level so fundamental that it reaches back to the Triassic origins of the Archosaur lineage, would have had a quality of otherness, of genuine biological alienness, that the encounter with any mammal, however large and dangerous, does not quite produce. Mammals are our relatives. Even the most terrifying large predatory mammal, even the cave lion or the short-faced bear, is built from the same basic mammalian body plan as we are, with the same general arrangement of organs, the same warm blood, the same capacity for something we can at least recognize as emotion and fear and pain. There is a kind of recognition in the encounter with a mammalian predator, a sense that this is something we can in some way understand from the inside, because we share so much of the relevant biology. A large theropod dinosaur, in contrast, is built from a body plan that diverged from our own before the first mammal existed. Its sensory systems, dominated in many species by extraordinarily acute vision with color perception extending into the ultraviolet, are configured differently from ours. Its thermoregulatory biology, even in the more endothermic forms, operates differently. Its social and reproductive behaviors are grounded in archosaur neural architecture that has only distant evolutionary relationship to the mammalian circuits that govern our own behavior. It looks at the world differently, it processes the world differently, and the experience of being looked at by it, of being assessed by a visual system and a cognitive system that are genuinely alien to our own, would have had a quality of encounter with the other that is unlike almost anything in our actual experience. There is a passage in the naturalist writer Barry Lopez's work where he describes looking into the eyes of a wolf and the specific quality of consciousness he encountered there, and the way that encounter produced in him a sense of being seen by something genuinely other than human, something that looked back with an intelligence of its own kind. Lopez writes that the encounter produced in him a kind of clarity, a sense of having been, for a moment, pulled outside the anthropocentric frame in which human consciousness ordinarily operates, and placed in a larger frame where the human is simply one thing among many. The encounter with a large, cognitively active theropod predator for the alternate world's humans would have produced something of that quality, but amplified enormously by the animal's scale and the genuine danger it represented, and the 66 million years of entirely different evolutionary history behind its eyes. The alternate world's humans would have spent their lives on the boundary between the human frame and a genuinely alien other. Not in the metaphorical sense that we sometimes use that word about the natural world, but in the precise sense that the animal they were looking at had been shaped by a completely different evolutionary lineage, operating on a completely different timescale. That experience would have been one of the most formative things in their cultural and psychological lives. It would have been inescapable. It would have been woven into their understanding of what it meant to exist in the world, into their cosmologies and their ritual traditions and their sense of their own place in the order of things. And it would have produced, I think, a kind of humility about the human place in the living world that is genuinely different from the humility that environmental crisis is now trying to teach us in our actual world. Because theirs would have been a humility grounded in daily experience, rather than in abstract knowledge, in the lived reality of sharing the world with something much older and much larger than themselves, rather than in the intellectual understanding that we are damaging the ecological systems we depend on. The dinosaurs of our alternate world would have been, in this specific sense, one of the most important teachers that the human species ever had, not intentionally, not knowingly, but by the simple fact of their existence, their scale, their otherness, their persistence across millions of years that encompass the entire span of human evolution. They would have taught every generation of alternate world humans the same lesson. You are not alone here. You are not the largest thing. You are not the oldest thing. You are one lineage among many, one experiment in the vast project of life on this planet, and the world was here long before you and will be here long after. Be careful. Pay attention. Know the animals you live among, and be always appropriately small. That lesson is one that our actual world is struggling to teach us now, through different means and under different circumstances. The alternate world's humans had it delivered to them every morning when they looked out from their sleeping ledges at the world below, and every night when the fire burned low and the sounds from the darkness beyond it reminded them of what shared the planet with them. There is one more thing I want to explore before we begin the long arc toward sleep, and it is the question of what alternate world humans would have eventually done with the large dinosaurs as their technology advanced and their populations grew. Because the history of our actual world gives us a template, and it is a complicated one, full of both loss and adaptation, and the long, painful process of learning to live with the consequences of what intelligence and technology make possible. In our actual world, the pattern is clear and well documented. Wherever modern humans arrived in a region where large-bodied megafauna had evolved without any prior human pressure, those megafauna went extinct in a relatively short period, usually within a few thousand years of human arrival. The megafauna of Australia, which had been isolated from human populations until approximately 65,000 years ago, collapsed rapidly after the first modern humans arrived. The megafauna of the Americas, isolated until humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, experienced a similar rapid collapse. Even in Africa and Eurasia, where megafauna had coexisted with evolving hominins for millions of years and had developed some degree of wariness around human hunters, the final arrival of fully modern humans with sophisticated weapons, technology accelerated extinction significantly. The pattern is not simple or uniform. Climate change played a role in some extinctions. Some species survived because of behavioral flexibility or because they lived in environments that humans exploited less intensively. But the general trend is undeniable. Modern human hunters, with their projectile weapons and their cooperative strategies and their ability to persist through multiple seasons toward a specific target, were the most effective large animal hunters that had ever existed, and the large animals of the Pleistocene could not adapt quickly enough to the new level of predation pressure. In our alternate world, the large dinosaurs would have been in a qualitatively different situation. They had not arrived to encounter modern humans at a single moment in history. They had been co-evolving alongside evolving hominins for the entire span of human evolution, from the earliest Australopithecines to the first fully modern humans. Over that span, the dinosaur fauna would have accumulated several million years of experience with the small, upright, tool-using creatures. The specific behaviors that made them vulnerable to human hunters would have been selected against. The individuals who recognized the particular threat that human groups represented, who moved away from human settlements, who avoided the specific landscape configurations that human ambush hunting depended on, would have survived at higher rates and left more offspring. This is the same dynamic that explains why the megafauna of Africa, which co-evolved with hominins, survived better than the megafauna of Australia or the Americas, which did not. Animals that have evolved alongside human hunters develop wariness and avoidance behaviors that confer significant survival advantage. In our alternate world, this coevolution would have been even longer and more complete than it was in Africa, because the dinosaur lineages would have been subject to hominin hunting pressure for millions of years longer than any actual megafauna. This does not mean the large dinosaurs would have been invulnerable to hunting pressure as human technology advanced. As human projectile weapons improved, as poison technology became more sophisticated, as cooperative hunting strategies became more elaborate, the pressure on large dinosaur populations would have increased. Some populations in some regions would have declined. Local extinctions would have occurred, particularly in areas of high human population density. The trajectory would have resembled, in a general way, the historical relationship between large carnivores and livestock-keeping human communities in our actual world. A gradual retreat and reduction under the pressure of both direct persecution and habitat modification, with populations persisting in regions of lower human density and higher wilderness. But total extinction of the large dinosaur lineages across the whole of the alternate world seems unlikely before the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. The sheer geographic range of the tropical and subtropical zones, combined with the co-evolutionary behavioral adaptations of the dinosaurs themselves, would have provided a buffer against the kind of rapid extinction that happened to the Pleistocene megafauna in our actual world. The alternate world might have arrived at its equivalent of the 20th century, with large dinosaurs still present in protected wilderness areas, in the way that elephants and tigers and great apes are present in our actual world, reduced and threatened, but alive. And the cultural and spiritual traditions built around those animals, accumulated over millions of years of coexistence, would have remained enormously powerful social and political forces in the alternate world's equivalent of the modern period. The conservation of large dinosaurs in this world would not have been merely an environmental or scientific cause. It would have been inseparable from the most ancient and most deeply embedded traditions of the culture, from the ceremonial obligations and the spiritual commitments, and the accumulated knowledge that had been part of human identity since before any other institution existed. The alternate world might, in fact, have done better at protecting its large animals than our world has done, precisely because the cultural connections to those animals were so much older and so much deeper. That is perhaps the most interesting and the most hopeful note that this thought experiment strikes, that the depth of the relationship between humans and the natural world, the degree to which that relationship is embedded in culture and identity and spiritual life, matters for how we treat the world around us. Our actual world's megafauna suffered partly because the cultural traditions that had accumulated around them were disrupted, because colonialism and the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems removed the specific human communities whose entire cultural identity was organized around coexistence with those animals. The alternate world, where those traditions would have been even older and even more central, might have been more resilient in this specific sense. We carry, in our actual world, the residue of those old relationships, the cultural elaborations that our ancestors built around the animals they lived with, the bear ceremonies of the circumpolar peoples, the lion traditions of the East African pastoralists, the whale songs of the coastal hunters, the deep, cross-cultural human fascination with the predators and the giants, with the animals that represent something about the scale and the power of the living world beyond human control. These are echoes, faint but persistent, of a relationship that was once the organizing principle of human cultural life. A relationship that the alternate world would have maintained in full voice for all of its history. There is another dimension of the alternate world that deserves careful attention, and it is one that the actual fossil record has revealed only recently, overturning decades of assumption and replacing them with something far stranger and more visually overwhelming than the old picture. The question of dinosaur appearance, of what they actually looked like, not just in terms of shape and scale, but in terms of color and surface texture and the visual complexity of their bodies in life. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were depicted as grey or green or brown, uniformly dull in coloration, like giant lizards scaled up from the modern reptilian world. This assumption was never based on evidence. It was an argument from silence, an assumption that because we did not know what color they were probably the default color of large animals we already knew. The fossil record, which preserved bone and occasionally impression of scales or skin, said nothing about color. So artists defaulted to the muted palette of modern large reptiles. And that palette became so embedded in the cultural representation of dinosaurs that it felt like fact. Then the feathered dinosaurs began to change everything. The first unambiguous feathered dinosaur fossil, Sinosauropteryx, was described from the remarkable Yixian Formation of northeastern China in 1996, and it was not the last. The Chinese fossil sites produced over the following decades a cascade of theropod dinosaurs preserved with unmistakable evidence of feather-like integumentary structures, ranging from simple, filamentous proto-feathers to complex asymmetric flight feathers of the kind seen in modern birds. These fossils were not just scientifically revolutionary, they were visually spectacular, often preserved in extraordinary detail, showing the precise shape and distribution of feathers across the body. And then, beginning around 2010, researchers developed methods to extract information about color from fossilized feathers. The technique relies on melanosomes, the microscopic pigment-bearing organelles found in the cells of feathers and hair, which can survive fossilization in identifiable form. Different melanosome shapes correspond to different colors in modern birds. By mapping the distribution of different melanosome morphologies across a fossilized feather, researchers can reconstruct the color pattern of the original feather with a degree of confidence that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The results have been astonishing. Sinosauropteryx had a reddish-brown body with a striped tail, white and reddish-brown alternating bands that would have been visually striking. Anchiornis, a small feathered theropod from the same Chinese deposits, had a black and white patterned body with a reddish crest and reddish face patches, a combination that some researchers have noted resembles the coloration of a modern woodpecker. Microraptor, a small four-winged theropod, had iridescent black feathers similar to those of a modern crow or starling. These were not dull, grey animals, they were visually complex, sometimes brilliantly coloured, equipped with plumage patterns that clearly served communication and signalling functions, exactly as the elaborate coloration of modern birds does. Now, melanosomes and direct colour evidence have been recovered only from small feathered theropods so far, because these are the ones preserved in the exceptional chemical conditions of the Chinese sites. But the evolutionary logic applies more broadly. Colour and display structures in modern birds serve specific functions: mate attraction, species recognition, territorial signalling, threat display. Natural selection for these functions is extremely powerful, and there is no biological reason to think that the larger theropod dinosaurs, or the ornithopods, or the ceratopsians were exempt from these same selective pressures. The elaborate crests of hadrosaurs, the horns and frills of ceratopsian dinosaurs, the bony crests and knobs of various sauropod and theropod lineages are all consistent with structures that serve display functions and were likely accompanied by striking coloration that we cannot yet directly measure. In our alternate world, 66 million more years of sexual selection and species recognition signaling would have had the opportunity to elaborate these display structures and color patterns to extraordinary degrees. The diversity of bird coloration in our actual world, from the iridescent structural colors of hummingbirds to the brilliant reds and yellows of tropical tanagers, to the complex eye spot patterns of peacock feathers, represents the output of roughly 66 million years of avian evolution since the end Cretaceous. Apply the same evolutionary clock to the broader theropod and ornithopod and ceratopsian lineages, and the visual complexity of the result would have been extraordinary. The alternate world would have been, among other things, a world of astonishing visual spectacle. Large animals displaying to each other in ways that used colour and pattern and structure that no human eye has ever actually seen, because the lineages that would have produced them never made it past the end Cretaceous in our actual timeline. The display behaviours of large alternate world theropods, performed at breeding season with the full deployment of whatever colour structures evolution had produced over 66 million years, would have been among the most spectacular visual events in the history of animal life. And human communities living in proximity to these displays would have had that spectacle available to them, season after season, generation after generation. The impact on human art and symbolic culture would have been profound. The specific colours and patterns associated with the most important animals in the environment are consistently incorporated into the symbolic vocabularies of cultures that live near those animals. The red of the red-tailed hawk features in the ceremonial dress of many North American peoples. The spotted pattern of the jaguar appears in Mesoamerican iconography across a span of thousands of years. The stripes of the tiger permeate South and Southeast Asian religious art. In our alternate world, the specific display colours of the most culturally important large dinosaurs would have been among the most symbolically charged visual elements available to human artists and ceremonial practitioners. The pigments used to recreate those colours in body decoration and in cave art and in whatever other visual media alternate world humans developed would have been among the most precious and most carefully sought materials in the human world. The ceratopsian lineage deserves particular attention in this context because the actual Cretaceous ceratopsians were among the most visually elaborate animals that ever lived. The frill of Triceratops, that enormous bony shield extending from the back of the skull, bearing multiple large fenestrae, openings in the bone and almost certainly covered in brightly coloured skin in life, is one of the most dramatic structures in the entire history of vertebrate evolution. The horn arrangements of the various ceratopsian genera, ranging from the three-horned Triceratops to the elaborately frilled Styracosaurus with its multiple long horn-like projections, to the flat-frilled Protoceratops, represent a diversity of display structures whose function was clearly tied to species recognition and sexual selection. Ceratopsians were predominantly southern North American and Asian animals in the Cretaceous, though their range expanded as the period progressed. Their survival in the alternate world, and their subsequent evolution over 66 million years in a world with continuing competition from other large herbivores and continuing predation pressure from theropod lineages, would have produced forms of display elaboration that dwarf even the spectacular originals. The alternate world's equivalent of ceratopsian descendants, encountered by early hominins in the environments where those lineages persisted, would have been among the most visually memorable animals in the known world. Their frills. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Their frills and horns and coloration evolved to degrees of complexity that we can only imagine from the Cretaceous starting point. And in the intimate, attentive, empirically grounded way that alternate world human communities learn the animals of their world, those display structures would have been carefully observed and carefully documented and carefully incorporated into the symbolic life of the community. The specific way that a large ceratopsid descendant's frill flushed with colour during a territorial display, the particular arrangement of its horns and the way they caught the light, the specific calls it made during the breeding season, all of this would have been known in the communities that lived near these animals, with the same intimacy and the same detail that we know the behaviour of animals we have spent our entire lives observing. That intimacy of knowledge is perhaps the most important thing that the alternate world gives us as a thought experiment. Not the drama of the large predators, though that is real and profound. Not the visual spectacle of the large display animals, though that is extraordinary. But the quality of knowing that comes from living your entire life, and your parents' lives, and your grandparents' lives, and the lives of everyone who came before them, for longer than you can count, in genuine ecological relationship with these particular animals in this particular landscape. A knowing so deep and so embodied, and so continuously tested against reality, that it becomes something more than knowledge, in the ordinary sense. It becomes a form of being, a way of being present in the world that includes the full biological complexity of the world as an intimate part of yourself. That is the gift that the alternate world's humans would have had. And it is the thing that the actual world's long process of ecological simplification has progressively taken from our actual selves. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually and continuously, over the 10,000 years since agriculture began to make it possible to live in landscapes from which most of the biological complexity had been removed. We have gained enormously in many dimensions over those 10,000 years, but we have lost this. The thought experiment of the alternate world is, among other things, an invitation to grieve that loss a little, not performatively, not in a way that pretends the world before agriculture was uniformly better, because it was not, but in a quiet, honest recognition that something real and something important has been progressively removed from the human experience of being alive on this planet, and that the removal has costs that we are only beginning to fully understand. Let me bring you back, now, from this long journey through imagined time, because there is something I want to say about what this thought experiment reveals, not about a world that never was, but about the world that actually is. We live in a world from which most of the giants are gone. The last of the truly enormous mammals, the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhino, and the giant Irish elk, and the cave bear and the cave lion, vanished between roughly 15,000 and 4,000 years ago, with some island populations persisting even later than that. The dinosaurs, their reptilian cousins in the broader sense, have been gone from the non-avian lineages for 66 million years. What we have left are the largest animals that survived our ancestors' appetites and our climate's fluctuations, and even these are diminished. The African elephant is the largest land animal alive today. It weighs up to 7,000 kilograms. A large bull titanosaur sauropod weighed perhaps 80 to 100 times as much. The largest living land predator, the polar bear, weighs perhaps 800 kilograms. A large Cretaceous theropod weighed perhaps 8 to 10 times as much. The scale of the living world we inhabit is a fraction of what it was for most of the time that our lineage has existed. And something in us knows this. The megafaunal attention bias, the ancient neural architecture for large animal awareness, is still there, activated by elephants and by the giant reconstructions in natural history museums, and by the films that attempt to bring the Cretaceous back. There is a reason that dinosaurs have occupied the human imagination with such persistence and such intensity since the first fossils were identified in the 19th century. There is a reason that every generation of children rediscovers them with an immediacy and a passion that no other extinct animal quite matches. They are the shadow of something that our nervous systems are still shaped to respond to, even though the things that cast the shadow are 66 million years gone. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote that the history of life on Earth is a story of contingency, of improbable accidents that determined which lineages lived and which died, and that if you rewound the tape of life and played it again from any starting point, you would get something entirely different. The Chicxulub impactor is perhaps the single greatest example of this contingency in the entire history of vertebrate life. One rock, one angle of entry, one specific geology at the point of impact, and the entire course of vertebrate evolution for 66 million years was redirected. The mammals filled the vacuum that the impactor created. And from those mammals, we came. We are, in a deep sense, the children of the asteroid. We exist because of that catastrophe. The conditions that allowed our lineage to evolve, the open ecological space, the world without giant reptilian competitors, were created by the most violent event this planet has experienced since it formed from the solar nebula. We are improbable. We are contingent. We are here because of an accident of cosmic scale and cosmic timing. And in the vast majority of alternate universes where that rock flies past or hits differently, something else stands at the end of these 66 million years. Something that might be extraordinary in its own way, but that would not be us. There is a particular quality of feeling that this recognition can produce if you let yourself sit with it. Not vertigo exactly, and not exactly humility, though it is related to both. Something more like the particular wonder that comes from realizing how many things had to happen exactly as they did for you to exist at all. How many improbabilities accumulated across millions of years of contingent history to produce the specific conditions from which you emerged. The asteroid had to hit. It had to hit that particular rock in that particular way. The mammals that survived had to be the specific ones, with the specific genetic potential for the evolutionary paths that led to primates, and then to hominins, and then to our particular kind of mind. The specific ancestors who survived every ice age and every drought and every predator encounter in a lineage, stretching back 3 million years, had to have survived, had to have found mates, had to have raised children who survived in turn. The chain is so long and so fragile at every link that your existence is, from the perspective of all the alternate possibilities, a miracle. Not a supernatural miracle. An improbability so staggering that no other word quite captures it. The alternate world we have been visiting tonight, the world where the dinosaurs survived and humans evolved alongside them, is a world that almost was. Not a fantasy, but a genuine near miss in the history of life. The 66 million years that separate us from the Cretaceous were not a foregone conclusion. They were a gift from an impactor that hit the wrong place at the wrong time. Catastrophic for most of the life that was alive then. Ultimately generous beyond calculation to the small, warm, nocturnal mammals who inherited the emptied world. The people you would have been in the alternate world, the ones who watched theropod predators from the high ledge of a cave entrance and knew the movement corridors of hadrosaur herds across the seasonal landscape, were living the oldest kind of human life there is, the life of an intelligent animal embedded in a world of other animals. Reading the signs, learning the patterns, transmitting the knowledge, surviving by understanding. They were not less than you. In many ways, they were more connected to the biological world around them, more practiced in the cognitive arts of environmental attention, more intimately acquainted with the full scale of what life on this planet can produce. We have inherited their brains, the neural architecture that would have made them extraordinary naturalists and extraordinary hunters in a world of giants still runs underneath everything we do, even here, in the dimly lit rooms and the quiet hours of the night. It is the part of you that is still listening for large things moving in the darkness. The part that came awake a moment when I described the bellowing sound rolling across the floodplain at the beginning of all this. The part that is drawn to mountains and open landscapes, and the edge of forest and the sound of large animals in the distance. That part is very old. It is older than language. It is older than fire. It is built from millions of years of living in a world that was bigger and stranger and more dangerous and more wonderful than the one we inhabit now. Carry that with you as you drift toward sleep tonight. Somewhere in the deep past, your ancestors survived things that would stop your heart. They survived the cold and the hunger and the predators and the long dark winters and the droughts that lasted a decade and the rivals who wanted what they had. They were afraid, and they were clever, and they were loyal to each other in the face of a world that was often trying to kill them. They told stories in the firelight about the things they feared, and they painted those things on cave walls, and they passed down everything they knew to the children who sat watching them, because the knowledge was the survival, and the survival was the knowledge. You are here because every single one of them managed it. Across every improbable link in that long chain, through every near miss and every close call, and every morning that could have been the last, they kept going. And the world they lived in, whether it held mammoths, or theropods, or saber-toothed cats, or the 1,000 other dangers that have made us what we are, that world made us exactly this. Creatures capable of wonder, capable of imagining worlds that never existed, capable of lying in the dark and feeling the weight of deep time settling gently over us like the dust of ancient stone. The giants are gone, the ice has retreated, the fires of 10,000 generations have gone cold, but the stories are still here. And so are you. Close your eyes now. Let the ancient dark come in. Let the sounds of the world you live in fade to the background where they belong. You are safe, you are warm. The long day of the mind is ending, and what comes next is rest, deep and quiet and earned. The same rest that found your ancestors at the end of every day that they survived. Rest well. The morning is a long way off, and there's nothing out there tonight that needs your attention. Sleep. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.